Welcome to BL Perspectives. This is episode 2 of a YouTube series brought to you by the folks over at BoxLunch, where we discuss topical social issues as they relate to pop culture and explore how they intersect with real life. If you haven't seen episode 1 yet, just be sure to peep it. It's in the link below. I'm your host and moderator, Albert Lawrence. And if you aren't already familiar with BoxLunch, check them out at a mall near you or online at BoxLunch.com. I promise you they have the most awesome collection of pop culture merch for all of your favorite fandoms. In episode 1 of our 4-part series on race and pop culture, we explored how pop culture influences our perceptions of others. Well, here in episode 2, we'll take a look at the impact entertainment has on our individual identities and how it shapes how we view ourselves. I'd now like to introduce you to our panelists. Please welcome Kendra James. Kendra is an editor, writer, and critic who's written for Shondaland, Elle, Cosmopolitan, you name it. She is currently working on a memoir, Onboarding, about her time at a New England boarding school for Grand Central Publishing. Welcome, Kendra.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now let's welcome KHLEO Thomas. KHLEO works on and off screen as an actor, influencer, artist, and entrepreneur. His lifestyle brand, Slick Living, promotes personal growth, positivity, hard work, dedication, and more importantly, being aware. Welcome, KHLEO.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And now let's welcome Alyssa Mancow. Alyssa is a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, writer, and a group practice owner based in Sherman Oaks, California. Alyssa received her BA in sociology from Cal Poly Pomona and her Master's of Social Work from USC. Welcome, Alyssa, and thank you everyone for joining us on this panel today.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here with everybody.
Yes. So we are now going to dive straight on in. We're going to talk about identity. So the term identity seems to have truly broadened in scope as of late, especially over the past several years. But today, when you hear the term identity, what do you believe that it encompasses? I'm actually going to start with Alyssa because you got those stack of degrees and I want to see what does this mean from you?
So in social psychology, what identity truly means is it refers to who you are, and this encompasses our beliefs, our qualities, and our personality characteristics. And this also encompasses our self-expression. In just straight up psychology, what identity means, it's our self-image, so how we view ourselves, our self-esteem, and how do we think others view us also. And there are intersections to our identity, so this includes racial identity, cultural identity, ethnic identity, gender identity. So all of those things just tie into who we are and who we believe that we are.
Gotcha. And so since this just really does tie in, it seems like it's a double lens, right? In terms of like, who do we believe we are? Who do we believe that others believe that we are? Mm-hmm. And I feel like, Kendra, especially since you've had the experience of going to a boarding school, I feel like you probably have your own sort of perspective in terms of what identity means for you. So what's that for you?
Identity has always been, there's obviously the way that you can do it is I'm a Black woman, and those are two very large identity sort of buckets or cups that I fit in. But then for me, it always separates down, and what it really comes down to is an identity is part of a community that you can choose to belong to or choose not to belong to. And you don't always have to identify as what you are. For instance, I know quite a few people who might be part some ethnicity, but don't necessarily identify with that part of that ethnicity because they were not raised in that way. But they are still accepted within that community and still have the chance to learn and grow within that space. And for me, drilling down into those different identities. So I'm a Black woman, but I'm also a Black woman who is a nerd. I'm a Black woman who was raised in the suburbs, which is it adds a whole other layer to things and sometimes, and so it's really about figuring out which of those things you can really resonate closely with and then building a community out of that.
Well, I mean, that can be quite a challenge just to even discover about yourself, what does resonate with you. And so KHLEO, as someone who's you work on the camera, you work off the camera, you built a lifestyle brand. I feel like identity and lifestyle are probably really woven in together. So for you, what exactly does identity mean to you?
I think our generation did ourselves a disservice by kind of following a system that was put in place for all these years of, having to put everything with a label, everything with a box. Myself being half black, half Moroccan. Either way you cut it, my roots run back to the continent of Africa. So the fact that my skin complexion may be lighter than everyone around me, I have to deal with sometimes the light skin thing or this, that, and the other. But my image, my identity, what I resonate with, it's all expressed when I talk, when I move, how I dress. It's all been the foundation of building who I am at this age, through these years. Finding these ways to continuously be able to, be self-aware enough to be happy, first and foremost, with, all the crazy stuff going on as far as social media, people, the things they say, but you have to be just aware of as far as who you are. And that's what I've always tried to, get that point across to people through the years.
You mentioned social media. We mentioned these outside influences really having an impact on how we view ourselves. But so for pop culture, what kind of impact do you think that pop culture has on the way that we actually start to form our own identities?
It has a heavy impact. I believe you look at the younger generation, they were introduced immediately from birth to the internet. I come from a generation where we still had AOL dial-up. It was still it was a different age. We had MySpace first. But I was just out not too long ago, and I look over and I see a 6 and a 7-year-old on an iPad playing a very viral video game called Among Us, and it let me know that generation is immediately shown the world at their fingertips. So pop culture, the things that we see, the things that we hear, who we resonate with, the characters, how people talk, how people dress, the movies, it's all right there at the younger generation's fingertips. So I believe it starts very early, man, and we got to be very aware of that to try to make things better for the next generation coming up behind us.
You talk about the impact that television has on the formation of identity, and each generation arguably has its own different television shows and films that ends up shaping them. But Alyssa, do you think that there are any perhaps television shows or film properties that helped you to shape your identity that now are kind of back in the cultural zeitgeist that somehow are also shaping those of your peers around you as well as some of the younger folks?
So growing up, the shows that I watched were like Saved by the Bell, Family Matters, TGI Friday, like Step by Step, all of those things. And I do think that those shows did play a role in shaping my identity, because what we do know about identity formation is role models can shape your identity. And growing up, you find a lot of your role models in your immediate environment or on TV, right? And so I think just like seeing certain people and their friendships and their humor, I think a lot of that shaped kind of just the way I view myself or how I wanted to be growing up.
I mean, you mentioned some shows that are coming back now in different forms, right?
Yeah. Saved by the Bell.
Saved by the Bell.
Yeah.
It sort of reminded me, there's like a direct parallel for me. I grew up watching Boy Meets World, one of the TGI Friday shows. And Angela was such like a huge thing for me, because Angela was the black character on Boy Meets World, and she comes in and she's dating Sean, and she's hanging out with like all these white kids, and it wasn't always brought up, but occasionally she would drop a line that just like sort of reminded you that she was an outside, that she knew that she was an outsider in that situation, even though they were all really good friends. But she'd make a joke or something about like there was one about like her middle name being Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard or something that like no one in the friend group understood. And so it was funny to watch Girl Meets World come back on, and not only to see my reaction to that, which was like when Sean and Angela both come back onto that show, and I had to literally get up out of my apartment and like take a walk around the block because I was so excited. But it was also really interesting to see young kids' reactions to that show, and to see sort of the cult of personality that formed around Rowan Blanchard, the star, who is a white actor, but she was so very openly pro like LGBTQ advocacy and so much other stuff, and to see people really flock to her, and to see her giving that support to a new generation of young fans was really interesting to me, and was doing sort of the same thing I felt like that Boy Meets World was doing for me when I was that age, of the right age to be watching it, even though I was 27 and watching Girl Meets World.
No judgment here. No judgment here. None at all.
Yeah, like that whole the ritual of us all watching TGIF, you know, on those Fridays. Like, I feel like at that point, we all, for the most part, perhaps like had a collective viewpoint of what identity kind of was. It was being fed to us in a certain kind of circuit and route. But now we're in a time where with streaming, where with everything being on demand, people are being able to choose and pick and choose from so many different options. So I feel like in a way, things have diversified even more in the pop culture identity landscape. So what are those pop culture gems right now, you think, that are truly emphasizing identity and perhaps shaping a general identity, a collective identity? Or is there even a such thing nowadays as a collective identity?
It's interesting. I think, like we were just talking about, streaming has spread everything out so much. There were only 3 channels that I could watch when I was younger, pretty much. I was like watching ABC, Nickelodeon, and PBS. That was where I lived. And then WB Saturday morning cartoons. But now there's just so much for people to watch that I'm not sure you see that sort of mass glomming onto one thing, unless you have something so rare like Game of Thrones, where it felt like even 8-year-olds were watching that. And so it's harder to sort of pin that down, I think. But what I think you do have is more shows for more children and teens and everyone of different backgrounds, so that at least people have more options to gather around, even if there's not the same amount of diversity within that programming.
Cleo, do you have any thoughts in terms of like what are some of those current shows, games, films you think that are truly helping people to shape their identities?
I agree with Kendra that there's so many different pockets of diversity. So, you know, you can't pinpoint just, you know, one thing, but we look at shows like Blackish, we look at shows like Mixedish, even in the video game medium, to see so many characters of color being now the lead character at the front of the video game. Like, that's such a new thing to happen. You know, I grew up playing games like Mortal Kombat, and who did I pick? 9 times out of 10, I picked Jax. Why? Because I like Blade, and why? That was the black guy. That was simple and plain, you know. But does he have a real good storyline? No, because it was Liu Kang's story or Johnny Cage. It was a whole other thing to go on. But we're seeing so many games. You know, just speaking from the video game format now. There's games now that are putting characters of different ethnic backgrounds, sexual orientations, gender, it doesn't matter. They're making sure to highlight those things as well now, and that wasn't there before. I still think we're a long ways away from, you know, seeing the hit video game of the year. Like, I would love for Halo, for the Master Chief guy to take his helmet off, and guess what? The guy looks like me. I'm like, yeah, that was platted. I would like that, you know, or it looks like you, brother. Yeah, man.
Alyssa, I heard you say a yeah in there. What resonated with what Cleo said?
Oh, I was just thinking your video games. Every time I played video games, I was always Chun-Li because that was the only person that looked like me. And she wasn't even Filipino, but I'll take it. Because I'm Filipino. She wasn't even Filipino. I'll take it. And I do think we have a long way to go because it's 2020 and I still haven't seen anyone that looks like me. All of the Filipinos that we have in the media are mixed. They're all mixed that you don't even know they're Filipino until they show a picture of their mom on Instagram or something like that. And you're just like, oh, okay, they're half. And, you know, I still think we have a long way to go because even the people that are being represented in the media, they all still have very colonial features. So they all kind of have this very same, so like the representation is still very kind of in line with what society wants to portray for other races.
I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more if you're cool with that. Like, do you mentioned specifically Filipinos, but like, do you also, is the same kind of true across the board for any culture that perhaps is not that of the majority?
Yeah, I would believe so. Any culture that's not that of the majority, I think we're there, but we have a long way to go. And when I say we, I mean collectively NBPOC or BIPOC people, you know, we are the sidekicks or in the background or the helpers, you know. So we're there, but like a dash of it.
All of my favorite characters when I was younger were rarely were they the main characters, especially for Black women. Because like I mentioned, there was Angela and she was a late addition and she was not a main character. But then for me also, Batman Beyond was such a huge show for me because there was Max Gibson was on that show, and she, again, not introduced in season 1, came in season 2, and she was like the best friend helper character. But because she was kind of one of the only Black women in the genre stuff that I liked to read and watch, I really glommed onto her, and she was a computer genius. I had no interest in math, no interest in science whatsoever, but that was kind of the one character that I just had, and so I had to sort of adapt my interests to focus on her, essentially.
Kendra, you mentioned the idea of seeing someone who you identified with, even just at least physically perhaps you identified with, but interest-wise not. And then having that interest of that particular character end up shaping and influencing your personal interest.
So it's not even that I became interested in math and science, because I took Algebra 1 twice and then never took math again. So my teachers were like, absolutely not, we don't want to deal with this. So yeah, it's not even that it shaped what I liked. It was more that I just had to find a way in, and I wrote a lot of fan fiction as a kid. So I guess I would just sort of adapt a lot of these Black female characters to myself, in that I would keep those core things that made them them and that the original creators and writers had given them, but then I would just imbue them with some stuff that I liked so that I would have something to do with them and something to write about. And it just made it a lot easier for me to connect with fandom as a whole. And if there weren't Black women in the shows that I was watching, I would usually just then make one up for fan fiction. And so I wrote a lot of very bad self-insert fan fiction in order to really fully connect with the fandoms that I was interested in.
You probably didn't even fully know that fan fiction was a thing.
Yeah, I discovered it pretty early. I was on fanfiction.net in 1999. Yes. Yeah, that was really, honestly, fanfiction was what really started to help me connect to things in terms of fandom where I wasn't represented, because it was just a free space to do whatever I wanted and to make up for the fact that people that looked like me weren't there, people that looked like a lot of my friends weren't there who were also into these things. I had a really diverse group of friends in middle school, and a lot of them weren't represented either. So I would write fan fiction for our group of friends, bring it into school, and like have them illustrate or like allow them to get like really hands-on with it so that we could all be connected in these fandoms.
So Alyssa, when you heard Kendra talk about how the pop culture that she was watching not only ended up impacting her, but also in a way also impacting the rest of the group of people that she hung out with because she shared that experience with them, is that something that's common? Is that something maybe that you experienced as well too, or do you think that's a very specific experience?
I do think that's common because I'm imagining kind of like the era that you grew up in, right? There's such limited exposure to what's around you, so you kind of have to gravitate to what's the closest thing to you, and then you create your community that way. So I think that it's common to the generation that we grew up in, and I believe that the generation now, because they're exposed to so much just because we have all the technology, they probably don't go through it as much as we did. Me personally, because there were no Asian representation growing up. First of all, the only Asian representation I had growing up was Sailor Moon, so I clung to that. I clung to that because that's all we. I don't even know if they were Asian, but because they never said where they lived, did they? I don't know. Do they say where they lived?
I could have sworn they said it was in Tokyo. I could have sworn.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong.
Maybe not.
We will fact
Maybe
check.
not the American
We will fact check.
It's Los Angeles. They're in Los Angeles,
Somebody
California.
please get on that. Yeah.
So I didn't have anything growing up that represented what I look like or where I'm from or how I grew up culturally. So for me, I had to go kind of like to the closest thing that I could. And I remember, so Jay-Z had a song and then he called Foxy Brown half black and Filipino. Turns out she's not, but I didn't know that for decades, right? So,
oh no.
So I she was, then after that, she became my favorite female rap artist. I loved everything because of that identity, that piece of like, oh, this person, they reflect me, they look like me and all of those things. And so that was a culture, those were things that I was going towards because that was the closest thing I had that reflected or I thought was like a reflection of how I grew up culturally.
I thought Catherine Zeta-Jones was Latina for the longest time. So like because of Zorro. So I understand like where you're coming from.
She's not.
Yeah.
And I love the Mask of Zorro. That's Antonio Banderas. That's Anthony Hopkins. Okay, all right.
Thank you,
learn something
Kendra.
every day.
Yeah, no, I got tricked. I got real tricked.
All right. Okay.
Oh gosh. No, but that's wild, right? How pop culture can make us think, like, just because of a role that a person is playing, like they inhabit that space in our mind, like as that actual culture. And it's funny when you mentioned Foxy Brown too, Alyssa, because I want to say she might have even had an album or something called China Doll, which now I wonder, is that okay? Is that okay?
Now.
The branding and marketing rollout for Foxy Brown? Wow.
Right?
They got away with murder. Okay. All right. All right.
Man.
All
Oh
right.
gosh.
Wouldn't survive in this era. Nope.
So everyone, we're kind of talking about what we've accepted in pop culture as being something for identity, and also some of the stuff that we've rejected, perhaps. But nowadays, like, we get a chance to really have these fandoms represented in a bunch of different pockets, largely because of the internet. And so, KHLEO, I want to toss this one over to you first, though. How do you think that pop culture has helped to kind of like fortify or create some of these subgenres that now we're able to, compartmentalize our identities even more through?
I grew up playing a lot of sports, and I'll never forget where my entire basketball team wasn't into Gundam Wing. None of them knew that anime. And they knew Dragon Ball Z, of course. Big shout out to your hoodie, by the way. I'm presuming BoxLunch provided that. Beautiful. Love it. None of them knew Gundam Wing. They weren't really into anime like that. And the only person who I could talk to about anime was, of course, my brother. As time has gone on with social media, you're finding so many people just like you who grew up around a bunch of people who did not like anime. They couldn't talk about it. If they did talk about it, they were considered weird. It was this whole weird thing regarding being anybody. If you were coming from an ethnic background and you were into anime, they're like, "Why aren't you just watching regular cartoons?" Like, no, I love anime. To see so many young black cosplayers, it really it makes me smile so much, because I would have loved to be able to walk into my school as Goku or as the lead character from Gundam Wing. Like, I would love to walk in as a Tuxedo Mask, but if people would have just assumed that, he just has, what are you the groom? Like, no, I'm Tuxedo Mask.
Are you a groom? Are you getting married today?
What is this? That's exactly what I'm telling you. That would have been the reaction. But with social media, you're able to find these pockets of people who are just like you, and it has helped empower each other, as well as how Kendra was just talking about, as far as her with writing her fan fiction, bringing people together and having something to empower each other with. It's helped me even later on in age, like, find new ways to stay creative. Last year I was Dr. Facilier, the Shadow Man from The Princess and the Frog for Halloween. Yeah. The year before that, I was Jafar from Aladdin. I was like, I got the nose for it, I'll do it. Yeah, so we did it. This year, I'm Powerline for Halloween, and I'm so excited for this. Like, this is like a dream come true. I'll never forget being in my my elementary school auditorium and like looking at what Max did for Roxanne. I was like, I'm gonna do that one day. I didn't know it would have took me 25 years to get it done, but that's just how the cookie crumbles with everything. But social media, I feel, is what has helped us find each other and empower those little pockets of people who are into so many things that culturally, or even within our own households, we weren't, I don't want to say allowed to. Allowed is a strong word, but it just wasn't helped. It wasn't nourished is the right word I'm trying to look for. We weren't nourished for those things. So yeah.
Wow, I'm just taking a moment because when you spoke about seeing Max in a Goofy movie and I still, some days I wake up and I sing the After Today song, which is all about the last day before summer starts, because there's just something there for it. But what's kind of neat about that too, KHLEO, is that now and partially because of the internet and partially because of streaming, a lot of these different things that were released when we were kids, they're now back and people are connecting with them in new ways. And it's funny, I saw something online where, and I don't know if people were kidding or not, but there are younger people who were joking that, they thought that Friends was actually a current show, a new show that was made about, that was basically a period piece, like made about the 90s, but made today. It's
Wow.
Nice.
Wow.
Nice.
Right.
God.
What did they think it was, a parody? Like, that's what it was really like in the 90s, to be like a bunch of white
Yeah.
people in New York. In
Yeah.
Small, okay, got it.
Oh gosh. So you spoke about basically how anime has, in a way, it has helped you to come into your own
Absolutely.
identity, and how you fully embrace that. That's kind of dope. I really want to lean on Alyssa, at least to get this next part of the conversation started, because now we're going to kind of transition and discuss self-efficacy, which, big word, big term. Alyssa, can you please help us to unpack that a little bit? Like, what exactly is self-efficacy?
So in psychology, what self-efficacy actually refers to, it's a person's intrinsic belief in their ability to execute specific tasks. And self-efficacy relates to your own personal confidence and optimism in being able to just accomplish something.
Kendra, going off of what Alyssa just broke down for us in terms of self-efficacy, can you think of any, perhaps like examples within the entertainment industry that just bring that principle, that bring that idea to life in a different way?
I mean, certainly like the do-it-yourself model. It's interesting. You hear a lot of people say that if something doesn't go right with a big studio for some movie that you're expecting, starring people of color, you'll often hear people then say, well, why don't you just make your own? Do it yourself. We should be doing this ourselves, not depending on Fox, not depending on Warner Brothers. And it's easy to say that, but in practice, that's much harder. In practice, yes, it can be done. You can be an Issa Rae who goes from The Misadventures of an Awkward Black Girl on YouTube to your own HBO show, Insecure. Now, I believe that took something like 5 or 8 years and a few New York Times profiles and some real struggles.
A lot of work.
Yeah, a lot of work. And it happened for her a lot slower than it has happened for, say, like a TikTok star who just became famous, a white TikTok star, I should say, who just became famous like 6 months ago and is now suddenly going to star in a She's All That reboot. So it's kind of like, there is self-efficacy and there is a value in having that go-getter Capricorn, Virgo, Beyonce spirit of like getting everything right and doing it yourself perfect. But in reality, there are barriers still in place as to how you can make that happen and what doors are open for you to make that happen.
It's all interconnected because two things that inform self-efficacy. Number one, your past experiences, like have you succeeded in the past before, right? And if you have, that's going to make you feel confident in upcoming things. And another thing that informs self-efficacy is role models. Have you seen anybody that looks like you doing it too, or have done it? So it's what we have inside of ourselves and what we have outside of us. So everything that you're saying about barriers makes sense because that's the second part that informs self-efficacy. What are we seeing happening outside of us? And how is that influencing our sense of self and our ability to do things?
And for those of us perhaps who don't necessarily have a lot of people within our family or within our neighborhood or just within our school, like it's pop culture that ends up kind of showing us and letting us know, oh, okay, yeah, you can do this, or so KHLEO, I know that since you do a lot of on-camera work, and I know you've been on some sets with some names, some very impactful people, how is self-efficacy, especially within like the Hollywood realm, how has that materialized within your life?
It wasn't until I want to say the last 5 years we've seen such a huge influx when it comes to Black creators really finding their own voices. Of course, we can look at Jordan Peele with the success of Get Out and Us. He wanted to tell a horror movie, a psychological horror movie, but he wanted to cast Black actors. We'd never seen it. And it blew everyone's mind. So we have people like Jordan Peele who took that upon himself to want to push that button. You got someone like, for instance, she mentioned Issa Rae, but the one that's the most to me even recently that stood out was Michael B. Jordan with his Outlier Society Productions. The fact that he made sure to make it a rule that it is a constant inclusion of Black people also behind the scenes. You know who else just picked up that? John Boyega, of course, from the Star Wars franchise. He recently spoke out about it. He wanted to start his own production company, and he wanted to tell their stories, our stories.
Alyssa, I kind of want to dig into some of your personal experience with pop culture as well, too, just in terms of like seeing yourself, how self-efficacy has played a role in your life. Because as someone who comes from the field of academia, but as someone who's still also very well versed in pop culture, how did that come together for you? Did you see somebody in pop culture who was a doctor and you were like, okay, yeah, this is good, I can do that?
Yeah, so again, we are very rarely represented, but if you're, I think, Asian in pop culture, you're either kind of like playing a very stereotypical role, like especially Filipinos, right? Like you're a nurse at a hospital or things like that. I don't think that my own career was influenced by anything that I saw in pop culture, but I think I kind of just had to make my own way, given that there's very little representation of just Filipinos in the media.
There are many people who are watching this, for example, by the way, thank you all for watching so far, who don't necessarily see somebody on this panel who looks just like them, right? But hopefully you're still able to tie in and to connect with these different experiences and stories that we're sharing, because there are some universalities to it. But that being said, there are people who don't look like us or who do look like us that watch television or film and they still don't really see themselves reflected. So what's the danger? Because there might be somebody who's like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. You don't have to see yourself in order to be it. You just get, but I want to know from this panel, what do each of you think in terms of, is it important? And if it's not, like, what's the danger in not being able to see yourself represented in pop culture?
I have a lot of empathy for people with Latinx backgrounds, Asian backgrounds, and also Indigenous backgrounds. Because when I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch every Black sitcom that was on television, but I was very aware that like Fresh Prince was on. I was very aware that the Jamie Foxx show was on. All of those shows that were on like UPN and WB, I knew about them. But I believe there was only like the one show from Margaret Cho at one point. That's a sitcom that starred an Asian American family. And so I always knew I was going to be a writer of in some way. And I always wanted to write television, movies, books, and I never really questioned the idea that I could break into the entertainment industry, because I always had in the back of my head, I knew it wasn't easy. I knew there was a lot of discrimination. I knew that things were not represented very well, but I always knew that we were there. And I knew that we had been there for a very long time, no matter what depiction was being played of us. But people from other backgrounds don't even have that necessarily. And so I think there is a danger in that, where it's just what we were talking about, the barrier thing. If you don't, some people literally have not seen someone who looks like them succeed in any way, to the level of, say, like a Marvel movie or a DC movie, whereas I have all of that representation. And yeah, so it makes it a lot more possible for me to believe it.
It's interesting because, Alyssa, you didn't necessarily see yourself represented, and yet you turned out fine. So do you think that you need to see that?
I absolutely do think that you need to see that. I think that if you don't see yourself represented in pop culture, in the media, that could really cause a lot of feelings of anxiety, depression, or a feeling of a need to conform to groups that just really don't feel authentic to you. I think, for me, I saw myself represented in one teacher in college. The first Asian teacher I ever had was in college. The first Filipino teacher I ever had was in graduate school. So that was enough for me to gain a sense of self-efficacy. But I know that for people who are looking for certain things in the media, maybe they want to be actors or maybe they want to be somewhere in film, there is a lot of danger when you don't see yourself represented, because then you will start to conform to something that doesn't feel authentic to you, because what's being marketed is sold as the norm or as what we're supposed to aspire to. And really what we know is what's being marketed, it's just not for everybody. So that's why we need everybody represented.
KHLEO.
Yes.
Kind of feeding off of what Alyssa just shared right there. Like, For you, what was the first time that you saw yourself on screen?
If I'm being honest, the first time that I saw myself on screen was the first time I saw myself on screen. If I'm just being honest, if I'm just being really being honest,
Makes sense.
you know, I grew up, of course, in the city of Los Angeles, so everyone is, it's just a melting pot of everybody here. But growing up as far as in Mid City and as far as the teams that I played on, everyone was darker than me. There were people with cornrows and dreadlocks, and my hair didn't lock like that. But I wanted the mystical braids. I did it because of that.
Mystical.
I had mystical braids as a kid. There's a picture out there somewhere with it. It means a lot to me though, knowing the fact that for years there were kids who looked just like me who had to adopt the nickname of Zero just because of the film, and they looked identical to me. They were light skinned with big hair. And, knowing that character resonated with them, not just because of being the underdog, but because they looked like me. And I've never had someone tell me that and tell me that they were bullied or it was a negative thing. They embraced that fact because I was there for them to resonate with.
And by the way, when you say that, you're talking about your role in Holes?
Yes. Yeah. Playing Zero in Holes. Yeah.
Kendra, I want to ask you the same thing. First time that you really just remember seeing yourself on screen?
Honestly, the person I most identified with was probably Angela, from Boy Meets World. The first time I felt represented, where I was like, okay, this is something this is a show that I like, and also I see myself here was Deep Space Nine, Star Trek.
Oh, wow.
The fact that Captain Sisko was the first black captain for a Star Trek show, the first black lead for a Star Trek show. And that meant a lot to me because we used to watch Star Trek around our kitchen table. It was like the only show we were allowed to watch at dinner. And so for me, seeing him as the lead on a show that I already naturally really enjoyed from Next Generation meant a huge deal to me and made a huge impact. And also the fact that he had a son who was a writer also really did a lot for me. Yeah.
The fact that you can trace the through line that's super neat. Oh gosh. So we've talked about seeing ourselves specifically represented on screen. Now kind of want to transition a little bit into diving into representation as a whole. So looking a little bit more at the collective. And Kendra, you mentioned this to a degree when talking about how there are many people who still don't see themselves on screen yet. Alyssa, what groups do you think are still kind of the most unrepresented in pop culture? Who do you think is really missing a chance to see themselves right now?
First thing that comes to mind would be those who identify or those who are non-binary. But if we want to talk about race, and this could just be me being biased and me coming from my own perspective, I would definitely say Asian people, okay. South Asian people, East Asian. I think that's very much underrepresented.
What kind of impact do you think that may have? And again, like I ask you about the impact thing because you really put some time in studying this. But yeah, what kind of impact do you think long term that will have on people who do identify as Asian?
So what we know about the media now and what we see about the media now, it's historically and currently a white dominated space. And when you have that, that's going to impact everybody who's not white, regardless of if they're Asian or not. It's going to impact everybody that's not white because, they're only representing themselves. So what that could cause long term is, just feelings of othering. We call it just othering, like feeling kind of outcasted or outside or just not part of the group. And when that happens, it happens on a very subconscious level. It's not something that you're aware of, right? It influences the way that you feel about yourself and your proximity to those people. So what happens is you try to conform. You try to conform without knowing it. Whether you speak like them or you dress like them or you want to be in proximity to them or you associate that with being better.
Yeah, and even if you don't see even if you're a person who is so self-confident that you want to be a black fighter pilot and you haven't seen a movie or a show about a black fighter pilot, but you're still like, you know what, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I want to do, whatever. It doesn't affect you directly, but what it does is sort of like bouncing off what Alyssa was saying. It tells someone else who's not necessarily of your same race that that's not something that black women do. So This white person has never seen a black fighter pilot represented in pop culture. So they're like, oh, that's probably just not something that black people are interested in. They just don't think of us in that space. And so what that then does is create an internal bias that you might not even be aware of when you're going up for a certain job, being like, well, I don't see you here, so why would I put you here? Even if that's not directly what you're thinking about.
When you talk about that idea of even the hiring managers, it impacting hiring managers in terms of who have they seen perhaps function in certain roles, because it ends up being sort of a self-perpetuating, and whether it's an implicit bias or an explicit bias, the fact is that it still does impact everyone collectively as a group, as a whole. KHLEO, I kind of want to lean into you on this one for a moment as well, too. What group, is there a group that you think is still truly lacking representation within pop culture?
You know, I had a friend who's currently working on the upcoming Marvel film, the Shang-Chi film, and he was the only black guy on set, and he works in the camera department. He works in the stunt and fight directing department. So to see him take a picture, they just wrapped filming. So to see him take that picture as the only black guy amongst an entire set of Asian people, it was an amazing experience for him, because he's also an anime fan. He appreciates the culture. He lived in Japan for like 5 years. So I know that was a big deal for him to even experience that, him being a black guy within the entertainment industry. So I gotta agree with Alyssa. I think that is a underrepresented culture that I can't wait till it gets more love and more looks at, because I would love to see it. I'm always curious. I'm just being honest, Alyssa, like my all my cousins, most of my cousins are half Filipino. So I grew up eating pancit and lumpia and adobo.
White rice.
Yes, I've been a part of the culture. So I understand even what my cousins don't get a chance to engage with, or they have to adapt to what the world may think that they should be like. So I do agree with you there.
I mean, hopefully some of the films, some of the television shows that are in production, like Shang-Chi, like you just said, hopefully these things, they will come out, they will be massive successes, and it will drive more. Dear Hollywood, we want more.
We just want more. Y'all gotta more. Come on. Since the camera was first turned on, we've been showing the same type of stuff. We over it, man. All the old stuff's on YouTube now. Can we get some of the new?
Along with that, we're talking about diversity. And we know that 2020 has been a huge year for the word diversity. In some ways, perhaps it's being used in authentic ways. However, it's still a big buzzword right now. And so I want to explore the differences between like tokenism and then just truly quality and authentic representation. Because we're talking about, throwing someone up to represent an entire continent of people because you're not being specific about who they are and where they're from.
They did the same thing with Moana, where Moana was supposed to be everyone sort of, it was like, is she from Hawaii? Is she from Polynesia? And then it turns out yes, no, she is a diverse mix of Southeast Asian and also Pacific Islander cultures. And that's why she's not from a specific place.
Listen, we don't know. We don't know what really, what goes into these decision makings. I do think that maybe what they're attempting to do is not just pinpoint one thing, because then that excludes. Maybe that's the or I don't want to say psychology because I don't know, but maybe that's the operation behind the actual decision making. But I still don't agree with it. I kind of agree with everyone else as far as if it's not specified, it doesn't give you that response that I think you're trying to get from the people who it's supposed to represent. And do we want that is my question. Alyssa, do we want, is that what you think is needed?
Representation?
As far as
specific representation?
Specific.
Yeah. Yeah. And we saw how everybody reacted when Black Panther came out. And I take it back. I did see myself represented in the media when Manny Pacquiao entered the scene, right? So, and then the Filipino community went wild. So we don't know how it's going to affect us until it comes out. But we know that when it comes out, people feel better about themselves.
True.
And it strengthens your sense of community and your sense of culture.
So it sounds like collectively you're agreeing that the specificity matters. It's not just necessarily what is the color of the ink of this character? What are the features necessarily of this character? But when we discuss the background of it, like the more specific that we can get with these characters, the more we feel truly seen, because it's like, oh my gosh, this person is just like me. How do you think any of us would be different if we would have seen more kind of specific representations of ourselves? And Cleo, like I'm really looking at you right now too, man, because I'm thinking, like, when you talked about your background, when you talked about your hair not necessarily looking the way that you thought that other black people, people who identified as black, how their hair looked and whatnot. So yeah, how do you think that you would have turned out, perhaps, if you would have seen Cleo on screen before Holes?
I'm pretty sure I would have a lot more confidence even earlier on in my life. I grew up in sports. I grew up in martial arts. My father taught, third degree black belt and things like that. So I grew up to find my confidence no matter what anyone had to say. But I do agree with the fact that what Alyssa mentioned, if we don't see it, it has a covert way of just, eating at you when you're alone. So I do think I would have been a lot more confident a lot more earlier on in my life. I wouldn't have had to go through these years finding ways to figure out what could empower me other than just, what was instilled in me from my family,
Let's talk about some shows, perhaps some films as well, that are hitting the mark. Who's doing it right? Who do you think, just in your personal estimation, who do you think is really hitting the true quality representation on the head?
What?
This is telling. The fact that we gotta take this time.
Here's what I'll say is I think different shows are handling different things really well. Whereas, we can't expect one show to handle every single topic. There are so many topics that would be too much. But I think there are different shows that do different things okay to well now. And I think that's kind of what it comes down to. I mean, again, a show that I'm probably too old to be watching. I really like to watch Craig of the Creek. It's this little animated show on Cartoon Network, and it's just about a black kid who likes to have adventures in his wooded backyard area, and it's very cute. And I think that is a perfect example of great representation. It is he's just a kid. His race comes up, but it doesn't dominate his everyday life, which I think sometimes people feel that if you're not white, that is just a significant thing that you spend a lot of time thinking about, which it's not for me necessarily, unless I'm asked about it in a situation like this. But yeah, so it's little things like that. I think that make for good representation. I'm trying to think of a more mainstream show. It's not like super coming to mind.
That's speaking volumes though, right there, Kendra.
For me, like I've enjoyed a lot of episodes of Blackish. I really have. I think they've done a great job of pinpointing things to shine a light on when it comes to the black community, and not only our community, a lot of other communities as well. Blackish has done an incredible job of highlighting. Grownish did as well, but Grownish speaks for a generation even younger than us. And whatever is going on at that age, like I have a little sister who's 17. We see the world completely different, but I'm so thankful to have her because I'm able to have these really in-depth conversations with her about what she sees in the world and how media is affecting her. So it's those two shows for me are doing a great job so far of kind of leading the way of what is the best way to now tell stories in this new modern era of social media and freedom of speech. I think they're doing a good job.
Yeah, I think Miles Morales is a really good example, or at least the way that Miles Morales was portrayed in Into the Spider-Verse, where it was very clear that this was an Afro-Latino boy growing up in Brooklyn in a bilingual household. Like, those were just like very specific things about him. There was no guesswork, and it just gives the ability for the kids who really resonate with that to just specifically connect with that character.
We have our first black Batwoman coming. Big shout out to Javicia Leslie. I think that is going to be so impactful for, look, me, I'm excited about that. I want to see that happen. You know, we didn't have that before. Who in the Bat family of Robins, Nightwings, there was no black guy or black girl in there. Now we have that coming. You know, to touch back on Disney really quick, of course, we have Yara Shahidi's getting ready to play Tinkerbell. We got Haley Bailey getting ready to play Ariel. So strides are happening for sure. In some lanes, but you know, I think everything moving forward is just really building off of the steps that have been put in place over these last 5 to 6 years, because they weren't here.
So look, now we've got these fandom universes that present us with a variety of different species on screen. So I know that we've got, for example, we've got a Star Trek expert on the panel today, so I want to give that Star Trek expert some time to dig on into this in a moment. But look, like we're seeing things like we're talking about Game of Thrones. We've got like the White Walkers, and you know, if we're talking about Lord of the Rings universe, we've got like elves. We've got all sorts of different kinds of species. But when it comes to actual humans who are starring in some of these things, do you think things are even there? Am I just like missing it? Or what are your thoughts there? I want to toss it out.
So specifically with Star Trek, what's interesting, so Star Trek Discovery just premiered its third season. And all of the human appearing, they're not all human necessarily, but the people who you would code as that, everyone in the season 3 premiere was a person of color. Oh. And yes, so there was not one like white humanoid on screen in that episode, whereas there were white actors like in, you know, blue makeup and that sort of blue and green makeup. But I like, even now, I got really excited seeing that, because that is simply not something you see. Like, if anything, it's going to be Zoe Saldana in the green makeup, like, you know, for Guardians of the Galaxy or whatever, not the reverse. So first there's that, which I think is something that we could maybe do more of. I have said to people at work, there were more white people in Black Panther than there were in the season 3 premiere of Discovery, which is wild. But so there's that. And then there's, in terms of the non-humanoid species, I 100% want to see more of that. And I remember, like, when I was younger, I was just such a genre person. That's all I wanted to watch. Vampires, werewolves, witches, all that stuff. And so if I'm watching, say, a Lord of the Rings movie, I had a huge crush, like every girl did, on Orlando Bloom. Because he was a hot elf, but there were no black elves in Lord of the Rings. And also there were no black cowboys in the Westerns that I was watching. There were no black pirates in Pirates of the Caribbean. So there were like none of these period or fantastical creatures that looked like me or like any other non-white person. And that is actually just as important, because then what you have is like me getting clowned, and rightly so, for like, oh, you only have pictures of like these white boys up on your walls. And it's like, well, because that's the genre that I'm interested in. And unfortunately, those are the only people being cast in those roles. So I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Like, this is what I'm interested in. So yeah, we need to see more people playing these non-human roles, even it's because it's fantasy. It doesn't matter. There's nothing dictating saying that there can only be white elves and all the orcs have to be indigenous. Like that's rules that we are making up from our own biases, or not we, but the people who are making these movies.
Alyssa, where do you think that comes from? Potentially, what's the theory there in terms of why are there so few people of color in these fantasy realms when, in essence, we're making it all up anyway, aren't we?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question you had asked prior, is we have to look at who is behind the scenes creating these things and what are their perceptions of what they're writing and how are they writing it. I think it all really goes back to the creators. And I think the onus goes back to them.
I would have loved to see more black wizards in Harry Potter, man. That's all I could put on it. I would have loved to see a whole lot more with black wizards in Harry Potter.
With not lazy names. Like, the part of the issue with Harry Potter, too, is... Part of that issue is, too, like, when you've got, like, a character like Cho Chang. That's not a name. Like, you'll hear people talk about how that is 2 last names put together by a woman who just didn't know any better. And so, yeah, Harry Potter is its whole whole can of worms.
They tried? Did they? Can we say they tried? Maybe? I don't know. do you get credit for trying? I don't know.
No, because then we have to talk about like the anti-Semitic goblins, and that just like that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it? Maybe it's this conversation.
Dangerous times, man. Dangerous times we live in.
Wow. I mean, so you're talking about stereotypes, and we're talking about how, shoot, even in fantasy, some of these stereotypes make it on in. And again, maybe it's because this fantasy is not necessarily being imagined by a diverse group of people. So when we're thinking about stereotypes in pop culture and the way we view ourselves, let's start talking about that on a psychological level now. Like let's dig into that a little bit more. Cleo.
Yes, sir.
As someone who's been around a lot of this, and so you've seen it on screen and you've also seen it on set, can you kind of talk about some of like what's the threat of there being a stereotype?
It's a major threat, man. I remember going to do fittings, right? And if I was casted in a role where I had to be the thug, right? All the clothes that they would put me in for castings, it was a hoodie. It was the baggiest of jeans. I don't even wear these kind of jeans, but it was so stereotyping that I didn't even have friends that wore that kind of clothes even anymore. That was out of style. So that was kind of blowing my mind as I'm in a fitting and I'm seeing clothes that are out of style, but you're still putting me in a Nietzsche and FUBU and Fat Farm. I'm like, no one's wearing this stuff anymore. But that was the thought process to them. Like, if he's a thug, he looks like that. I'm just like, that's not a good look, man.
Now, Alyssa, like while we're talking about definitions of things, stereotype threat. I feel like both Cleo and Kendra spoke about how stereotypes have kind of impacted and influenced them, but the term stereotype threat, is that in a way something that encapsulates what both of them shared, or is that slightly different?
It does encapsulate what they both shared. So stereotype threat has two meanings and they overlap. So the first definition of stereotype threat is a person's fear of conforming to the negative stereotypes of their race, culture, or gender. And then the second definition of stereotype threat is a person's fear of being perceived by the negative aspects or the negative stereotypes of their race, culture, gender. And oftentimes when that happens, right, that can lead to a lot of long-term negative mental health consequences.
Well, then along with that, on the other side of things, like, do we think, and we've mentioned some shows that are really taking steps forward in terms of representation, but are there any movies, any shows, anything you can think of that seems like it's actively kind of combating stereotype threat? I'm gonna throw a couple things in. I'm gonna throw a couple things in. I mean, maybe for example, someone earlier mentioned, I think it was you, Cleo, you were talking about Haley, who's now going to be playing Ariel in the live action Little Mermaid. And that's major. Like that's huge. That is massive. And raise your hand if you remember how Twitter kind of went off when that announcement was made. I didn't understand it, y'all. Please somebody break it down for me and or just empathize with me in terms of like why, when certain strides seem to be happening and being made, why can there be such a backlash sometimes and or just like this tension there with that? Somebody, anybody.
People like new when they want the new. Everyone wants something new, but only when they want it. It seems like, with this, the casting for Ariel becoming Haley Bailey. I'm like, you want to know a stereotype threat, and let's just keep it real. Like the thing, black people can't swim.
Oh, sure.
So you already know the Twitter was going rabid with that one. So I can't wait for the movie to release that shows that not only can black people swim, a black woman, a black goddess can sing and swim. So they can hold that one down.
Alyssa, any thoughts on like what's behind that that initial trigger reaction, that discomfort perhaps that people, that might arise within folks when they do see a new, but for something that they weren't prepared for?
I honestly, if I can be very blunt, I think a lot of it is just racism. I really do. I think a lot of it is just racism. The media has historically been very colonized, right, to represent the people who are creating the work. And now that there's more representation, or they're striving for representation, I think the people who have been largely represented are experiencing threat, even if they don't even identify themselves as racist. A lot of times, racism is very, very thinly veiled. It's very, very thinly veiled. So when things like that come out, it activates those feelings that are dormant, that are dormant day to day.
Look, well, here's the thing. Even in the face of racism, these castings are happening. Thank goodness, there are people who are bold enough. There are creatives who are visionary enough to see beyond what we necessarily have been raised with. So, and even when we talk about Miles Morales, for example, with Into the Spider-Verse. So I do want us to kind of end this to a degree with imagining the brighter future. Have some fun with this. So can we come up with some dream character / actor combinations that we would love to see happen?
I have a dream of a Bewitched reboot. I love Bewitched for some reason. I do have a dream of a Bewitched reboot starring a Black woman as Samantha, and her Darren is Korean American, and they relate to each other from being, she's an outsider in our world in two respects, because she's a witch, but also she's Black, and she doesn't know how to deal with the latter part because that's new to her. And then her Darren is a Korean American adoptee who also has had to deal with feeling like an outsider and otherism, and they bond over that. That's my dream. I don't think it's going to happen, but
Oh, it's gonna happen. Somebody call him for that. Oh, it's gonna happen.
Somebody just heard your pitch.
It's calling it right now. I'd greenlight it. If you're listening, I'd greenlight that. I'd watch that. So run that up, please.
Alyssa, what do you want to see?
My dream isn't as specific, but I think I would like to see a Filipino character, or even an Asian actor that isn't mixed with something else. Just somebody that is indigenous looking, that looks more like me. I would really like to see that. I know that there's a Filipino princess movie coming out called Rhea, if I'm saying it right. So I think that's, or she's not Filipino, but Asian.
It looks so good.
Asian, but it would be nice, what we talked about, that specificity.
This is a more personal take that I'm about to give on it. It was recently announced that the Static Shock movie is being worked on. Mm-hmm. And Static Shock was a big cartoon for me growing up, along with Batman Beyond, because they came on right after each other. Mm-hmm. There was a villain in that series named Ebon, and he was Static Shock's main arch villain. And the thing about his power was he was pretty much the shadows. He controlled the shadows. He was completely, he didn't have facial features. You just saw his braids, his earrings, his purple leather jacket, and his eyes. And I had this thought. I'm like, how crazy it would be to see a light-skinned actor pull that off because of a light-skinned Black actor pull that off, because us as we've always been treated in a sense like the outsiders. We're always, when it comes to our complexion, we're constantly have a finger pointed at us. Now, mind you, I understand the years of trauma that have caused those kinds of things. But even for me, I'm speaking for myself, the things I've heard, the things I've had to experience, I just feel like there's so many layers to that character that could be exposed. What's the first thing that a light-skinned superhero did? He turned his skin completely into a shadow, because he felt he had to have that feeling internally of, I am the most powerful villain within the Bang Babies block that just happened. So that's my dream role, and I would love to bring it to life. If DC's watching, come talk to me. We're gonna figure that out. And then look, man, I'm designed and ready to go for any superhero role. Let's go. Get the kid from the streets of LA all the way to the sands of Morocco. Let's go do it.
Yo, yeah. Wow. I mean, from the three of you, I want somebody to put the three of y'all in a development room.
Let's get to work.
Something greenlit. Let's have BL Perspectives have a spin-off of some creative content right here, scripted, beautiful stuff. Well, it seems as though, and collectively, and I think that you really did sum this up, Alyssa, in terms of what is the impact that we think that having these different kinds of representation seen would actually have on people and on future generations of folks. And it sounds as though collectively, we're saying that just mental health wise, even, these could have drastic implications. So we're looking at a healthier society. In the rest of this series, we're continuing to dive into the intersection of pop culture and race and tackle topics like appreciation and appropriation. And we're going to close out with the future of pop culture. So thank you, viewers, thank you, listeners, and thank you to our insightful guests for being here to continue this dialogue. I'm your host, Albert Lawrence for BL Perspectives, and I will see you next time with a new panel of guests for episode 3.